I have to say, Larry, that about 2 years ago, well, a little over a year ago, you and I met. And you and I talked about issues that were blocking labor's issues. And you said a remarkable thing. You said that labor's concerns aren't going to go very far unless we get democracy right. I want to salute you. I want to honor you. And I wonder if this group wouldn't also want to give you a round of applause for your tough leadership at this time. Now I'm going to ask all of you to stand up for just a couple minutes. You do that, look at each other. It's not a bad thing. Let me ask you to help me give my speech. I'm going to ask you to do it in 4 quick sentences. And then I'm going to let you sit down. And then I'm going to take 20 minutes to explain the 4 sentences. So here's how we'll do it. You know how to chant, so I'm going to call out a word, and I want you to call it back to me. Corporations.
Corporations.
Are not people.
Are not people.
Let's see that if we can do it again. Corporations.
Corporations.
Are not people.
Are not people.
Second chant. Money.
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 Is not speech.
Is not speech.
Democracy.
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 Belongs to us.
Belongs to us.
And the final one. We are.
We are.
We are.
We are.
We are.
We are.
The leaders.
The leaders.
We have been waiting for.
We have been waiting for.
Now you can sit. My father, Leroy Edgar, worked at the Elmwood Avenue plant of General Electric in Philadelphia for 37 years. He was a relay tester, a member of the union IUE. He sat at the same desk working on relays, and he was in the night shift. When he first started to work at General Electric, he was responsible for testing the quality of 8 relays in an 8-hour shift. Soon after, General Electric came to him after the war and said, now we need to test 16 relays in an 8-hour shift. He complied, learned how to do it faster, and at each time he washed his hands in chemicals every time he touched a part just to make sure that the relays were clean. When he died, at age 56 of a brain tumor, probably caused by some of the chemicals that he was washing his hands in, he was sitting at that desk testing 32 relays in an 8-hour shift. My father taught me about quality of life. He said, Bob, the first 8 relays were really tested well. He said, the others were tested okay, but the first 8 were tested well. His passion was for quality, and he knew how to provide that quality. Larry reminds me a little bit of a plumber that my father told me about. He told me the story of this plumber who was called into a big factory like General Electric that was humming and moving, and the pipes and the steam was coming out, and the processes were going, and the assembly line was going, and all of a sudden, everything stopped. The supervisor called frantically to a plumber to come. What's wrong? What's wrong? The plumber took a while, but got there. The plumber came into this large plant. It's completely silent. He walked around the plant. He looked at all of the moving parts that were no longer moving. He listened. And then he took out a wrench and he walked over to one particular pipe. And he tapped it. And all of a sudden, the plant came alive. It started to really churn, and everything was working really well. And the supervisor was really very happy. And the plumber was happy that he was able to tap at the right place. And he went away, and about a week later, the supervisor got a bill. And the bill was for $1,000. And the supervisor was furious. Supervisor came back to the plumber and said, "What is it? Why? Why was it $1,000? All you did was take out a wrench and tap it on that one pipe, and suddenly everything came alive." And the plumber said, "It only cost $1 to tap that spot. But it cost $999 to know where to tap." 50 years ago, Dr. Martin Luther King knew where to tap. I met Dr. King here in Washington at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. He had come here to talk with a group of laymen and clergy persons who were making the connection between the war in Vietnam and poverty. He walked down the center aisle of the church, and I was just a young seminarian up in the balcony looking down, and Dr. King spoke to this group some words that were powerful. He talked to us about the urgency of now. He shook us to the core and said, democracy is not based on war or money. It's based on average, ordinary citizens being part of the system. But here's what he said. He said, you and I will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of bad people, but for the appalling silence of good people. Larry is right. This is a time for us. It's a time for us to stand up and speak out more aggressively. Up until July of this year, I had 5 honorary doctorate degrees, but only 4 arrests for civil disobedience. I'm now delicately balanced, and if I have one regret in my life, it's that I've not been arrested for faithful civil disobedience enough. I wasn't arrested on Vietnam or on South Africa. I was arrested to try to stop the war in Iraq. I was arrested on nuclear proliferation, and I was arrested here in Washington praying at the Sudan embassy to try to stop the genocide that was taking place in Darfur. And last July 28th, the House of Representatives, both Democrats and Republicans, the Senate of the United States, both Democrats and Republicans, they were wringing their hands about the deficit that you'll hear a lot about. You heard them talk about how we have these $1 trillion of debt, and it's a shame, and blaming each other for the debt and deficit. A few religious leaders, 11 of us, organized and walked across the Capitol lawn and went into the rotunda. We were met by Shelley Pingree, who you'll hear from. We were met by another congressperson, and then we went up into the rotunda and we knelt in prayer. While the Democrats and Republicans of the House and Senate were talking about money and cuts and where they were going to find a way to balance the budget, not one of them recognized that you can't hold 2 wars and give the largest tax cut in the history of the United States. Very few of them were telling stories about the children who would be impacted by the cuts that were being made, or the elderly. Very few of them were talking about the persons on Social Security who weren't lining up at the food kitchens because we had put a safety net under them with Social Security being put in place in the 1930s. So we gathered, we knelt, and we were arrested. It was one of the most spiritual moments in my life. It reminded me that if we're going to change our government, if we're going to change the way things are happening to us, we need the courage to stand up and speak out when others tell us to sit down and be silent. We need to recognize that we've got brothers and sisters all over the United States, not just in labor, but in the environmental community and in the health community and the peace community and in the justice community. And all of us are hungry to get democracy to work. I'm the Forrest Gump of religion and politics. How many of you have seen the movie Forrest Gump? I stand next to famous people like Larry, but I was the pastor of a church in the coal regions of Pennsylvania at age 19. And the church was right next to the Gilbert and Coal Company in central Pennsylvania. The coal company owned all the land, all the outside of the houses, owned the local store that everybody went to. The coal miners only owned what was inside. You can imagine as a second-year student in college being pastor of a church where every member of the church suffered the loss of somebody who had black lung disease. And I learned to love poor people who had dignity and grace. I moved from that to going to theological school and meeting Dr. King just before graduation. But then I founded a shelter for homeless women in the city of Philadelphia because Philadelphia had 3 shelters for vagrant males, no shelters that would take women and children. But on October 20th, 1973, my life was changed. It was changed when the President of the United States, Richard Nixon, fired Archibald Cox for asking for Watergate tapes. I was offended. I looked the word Democratic up in the telephone book, and I stepped forward, and 1 year later, I got elected to the United States Congress. The highest office I held before being a member of Congress was being vice chairman of my son's parent-teachers organization. I was a non-lawyer. I had never taken a political science course, and I ended up in the Watergate baby class. And I represented the most Republican district in the nation to have a Democratic congressman. I tell you that story because I hope that in your process of learning where to tap, you'll tap some of your young people and your young adults to step forward and run for public office. For 25 years, the conservatives around Washington have said, let's get government off our back and out of our pocketbook, and government is the enemy. If we are the government, we are not the enemy. And we need to take back government. We need to take back the agenda. We need to join what Larry is doing. I became president of Common Cause just 4.5 years ago, and I have to tell you, I became president at a very unique time. Yes, I was a pastor. Yes, I was a politician for 12 years. Yes, I was president of a graduate school. Yes, I've done a lot of things in my life. My wife says I can't hold a job. But the most important thing that I've ever done in my life is become president of Common Cause. And I became president at the very unique time in history. Some of you know that just 2 years ago, the Supreme Court, by a 5-4 decision, decided to do away with laws that had been in place since 1907, laws that protected us from corporations dipping into their corporate treasury and spending them on politics. The Supreme Court said, corporations are people, money is speech, and in their decision, they put no restrictions on full disclosure. They didn't prevent foreign corporations from now meddling in our politics. And I have to say that Common Cause, working with labor, working with a lot of organizations here, as sad as that Supreme Court decision is, it's beginning to wake up America. People are beginning to recognize that money is corroding our system. My friend Bill Moyers came to our 40th anniversary celebration 1 year ago, and he looked out at the audience and he said, this is the most dangerous moment in U.S. history for democracy. We're either going to continue to be a nation of and by and for the people, or a nation that's of and by and for large corporations and the wealthy. We need to stand up. We need to take hold and recognize that we are being called to be the leaders that we have been waiting for. And by the way, I spent 12 years in Congress, and I know how hard you are going to work by going up and talking with the congressman. Just a little hint. Treat those congressmen as though you would want to be treated as if you were those congresspeople, and recognize they're not smarter than you are. Recognize they don't know more than you do. Think of them as people, human beings, who've had a little better economic opportunity, but you need to confront them with the truth. You can be a powerful, powerful force in your visits, but don't stop in just visiting them here in Washington. You need to go back in your local districts and hold their feet to the fire. We got to do a better job of holding their feet to the fire. 2 years ago, Citizens United passed, and Common Cause got geared up, and we decided after Bill Moyers gave his speech, we got a guy by the name of Robert Reich to be our chair, former labor secretary, really powerful guy, the first chair of a board that has a sense of humor and a sense of hope. And with their help and their enthusiasm, we decided to take on Charles and David Koch, the Koch brothers. You've heard of them? 18 months ago, I had not heard about them, but Common Cause decided, with the help of some labor groups in Florida, in California, and some people's organizations, we decided to expose David and Charles Koch, who twice a year had secret meetings with the Glenn Becks of this world in journalism, had secret meetings with the conservative elected officials to move our country more towards a corporate America than a democracy. So we went out to Rancho Mirage last January, and we decided to have a conference, but also a demonstration in front of their meeting. They surrounded their spa resort with police. They got up on the balconies thinking we were going to be violent, and all we were doing were exposing the terrible things that they were about. Here's one of the things we discovered. They bragged on themselves, and one of the things they said was, in 2007, Justice Scalia spoke at our secret meeting. In 2008, Clarence Thomas spoke at our secret meeting. And in 2009, the Supreme Court did an extraordinary thing. They took off of the court's agenda the Citizens United case, which was a narrow case. It was a movie that some conservatives have done, trashing Hillary Clinton. And the Federal Election Commission said, you got to disclose who's paying for that movie because it's a political movie. They took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court took that really little bitty case and did away with finance laws that had been in place for generations. We were pretty angry. We sent a letter to the Justice Department and said, we think there's smoke that Scalia and Thomas may have in fact been colluding with the Koch brothers. We think there may be fire here of a conflict of interest. And we also, by accident, discovered that Clarence Thomas had not filled out his financial statements properly. We thought for only 6 years, but in the next 48 hours when we brought it to the attention of the Judicial Conference, he repaired 21 years of his financial statements, where he failed to check a box that said his wife had outside income. And the following Monday, after he worked all weekend to repair his financial statements, the following weekend, he said, it was just too hard to understand. I share these stories only to say we exposed the Koch brothers. We exposed the fact that the highest court in the land had the lowest ethical standards. And we're working hard to force the Chief Justice to put in place ethical standards. They've exempted themselves from the Federal Code of Ethics. These are the same justices that this March are going to be considering health care legislation. And year after year into the future, we'll be dealing with issues of environmental justice and peace and justice. So we need your help. We need your help to continue to put pressure on our government not to allow money to continue to corrode its work. We need your help to push back on super PACs, which you've seen in the Republican primary. Even Gingrich and Romney are now complaining about super PACs. Their solution is wrong. Their solution is to give the anonymous money to them. We think it's important to have public financing campaigns. So let me be clear. Corporations are not people. Money is not speech. Democracy belongs to us. We, in fact, are the leaders that we've been waiting for. We need to change the way we fund political elections. And working with you and others, we want to see if we can install in the House and Senate in Washington and across the country public financing rules and laws that give average, ordinary people the right to run for public office. We want to install across the country disclosure legislation so that corporations and wealthy people who give big gifts have to disclose those gifts before the election in a timely fashion and not after the election. We want to repair the Federal Election Commission and make it work. We want to do something about redistricting where the incumbents draw the lines to keep themselves in office. And you're going to hear from my friend Donna Edwards that we want to amend the Constitution. Now, yes, it's hard to amend the Constitution. And yes, there are 13 different constitutional amendment bills in the House and Senate. Common Cause is accepting all of them and urging all of us to get to know what needs to happen to make a constitutional amendment. But we need your help. We want to do it backwards. Normally on a constitutional amendment, it's the House and Senate who work on the language and then send it back to the states. We want it to go the other way. We want average citizens to take to their city councils and their state legislatures binding voter instructions to mandate a constitutional amendment. And while we're not focused on the exact language, we are focused on three principles. We want to push back on corporations or people. We want to end the myth that money is speech, money can stifle speech. And we want to allow legislative bodies to control the amount of money that's spent in political campaigns. That would push back on Citizens United. That would move us in the right direction. My friend Hubert Humphrey was given an honor that no other sitting senator has ever been given. He was asked by Republicans and Democrats, when we had Republicans and Democrats working together, to give a State of the Union address just 6 months before his death. Humphrey took the podium in the well of the House. I sat up front. He told a story on himself. He said, one day my wife Muriel came up to me and said, "Hubert, you don't have to talk eternally to be immortal." But then he said, of all the words I've said, of all the speeches I've given, the most important words are these: that the moral test of government is what we do for those in the dawn of life, our children, those in the twilight of life, the elderly, and all of those in the shadows of life, the poor, the sick, and the disabled. I close with just a comment from my favorite political leader, Lily Tomlin. Lily Tomlin did a one-woman show on Broadway, and in that show she plays all the parts, and the leading person in the play is Trudy the Bag Lady. Now, Trudy the Bag Lady is dressed in rags, has a hat with an umbrella on it because nobody mugs anybody with a hat with an umbrella on it. She has all of her possessions in 2 shopping bags, and the play opens, and she's standing at the corner of Walk, Don't Walk, waiting for 2 aliens from outer space. She's been hired by those 2 aliens to search for intelligent life in the universe. The play is a great play. There are lots of nuances and stories in the play. My favorite is the end of the play. One of the aliens comes up to Trudy and pulls on her dress. She looks down, and the alien says, "Trudy, before we go back out to outer space, we need one more piece of information." She says, "What is that? You've come from outer space to search for intelligent life." The other alien says, "What we want to know about are goosebumps." And she says, "You've come all the way from outer space to learn about goosebumps?" Then she remembered the last time she had goosebumps was at a Broadway play. She took the 2 aliens to a Broadway play, and they stood in the back. 2/3 of the way through the play, she looked down, and both aliens were completely covered with goosebumps. And then she noticed they weren't looking at the play at all. They were looking at all the people, all the human reaction, the laughter and the tears of the audience. The final scene is Trudy is outside, and she's looking up, and she says, "I come out here and look up into the dark sky. I know sometimes they see the silly things we do with each other, and I can hear them laughing. But most nights I come out here and I see that the violations of human rights and labor rights and civil rights and the abuse that we make of children and the elderly, and I can hear them crying." And then Trudy looks out at the audience and says, "You know, maybe someday you and I will do something so wonderful, so marvelous, that will give the whole universe goosebumps. If we take back democracy, if we push back on corporations as people, if we fine-tune the Constitution to have speech be speech and not money as speech, if we find a way to be a nation of and by and for the people and for our children and grandchildren, if we find a way for labor's voice to be heard, if we find a way for each of us to have the courage to stand and speak truth to power, we'll give the whole universe goosebumps." God bless you.